I'm optimistic. I look around and everything is crap and I'm optimistic. I look around and the economy is collapsing and I'm optimistic. I look around and we've got a government actively bragging about how much money they can take away from poor people and I'm optimistic. I look around and I see a government that's deliberately trying to normalize white supremacy and I'm optimistic. I look around and I see governments and billionaires trying to silence freedom of expression, and I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic, and despite seeing a climate crisis that's only getting worse. Why am I optimistic? Because I look around and I see my generation and the generations below me, they see the same problems. They see the same crap, and they have the same opinion about it, that it needs to change. And that's because millennials, we broke the wheel. I ran a national youth campaign against Brexit, basically making the point that young people overwhelmingly don't want it. And by the time, well, the math said that by 2021, so a couple of years ago, we would have a population that either would have or did vote against Brexit. And whilst Brexiteers might have been able to defy facts and logic, they can't beat time or death. I was constantly told, you'll get over it. When people get older, they get more conservative. They will end up supporting Brexit. But that only works if Brexit doesn't make everybody's lives poorer, everybody's lives worse, increased cost of living, etc., which we know that it has, which every expert at the time in every field was saying it would. And so when the inevitable happened, which it is happening, we would get only further confirmation that the ideologies of the older generations, which led to Brexit, weren't just morally repugnant to us, but had the potential to seriously damage the quality of life of tens of millions of people. And so, and I often hear things like, oh, you can't let young people vote, or you shouldn't let 16-year-olds vote because they don't have the maturity to vote and understand these issues. But it wasn't 16-year-olds who trashed the economy because of a poster they saw on a bus. Now, I'm being flippant. Obviously, the reason behind Brexit was primarily about parts of the country that had been left behind for generations, been neglected and strangled by austerity for 6 years, and then the person telling them to vote for status quo was David Cameron, the same person responsible for that austerity, so it's inevitable. But the point is, that nagging feeling that young people have that the older generations know better, that they're the ones that can make these big political decisions far better because they know how the real world works, that was killed by things like Brexit. That was killed, and in the States, it's been killed by things like Trump and gun control and the mass shootings. As I said, millennials broke the wheel. The research shows that the silent generation, so people aged 78 to 90, and also boomers, also Generation X, heading that way, when they were 35, they were 5 points less conservative than the national average. Now, but when they got to age 70, they were 5 points more conservative than the national average. Now, if you compare that with millennials, they are, at the age of 35, 15 points less conservative than the national average. And Gen Z is always going to head in a similar direction. So we have very much broken that trend. And one of the reasons for that, I think David Aranovich mentioned it quite well, was that some of the issues that used to be considered to be up for debate, like equality, no longer are. Like, you can no longer say things like a woman's place is X, or try and use religion to justify homophobia and expect mainstream appeal. Now, yes, of course, people like Andrew Tate exist. But let's do this. If you date men in here, and you were to hear on a first date that your date really, really appreciated the views and Andrew Tate had some really good points, raise your hand if you would cancel all future romantic plans with that person. Yeah. So your generation, Gen Zs, have very much identified the cancer that is Andrew Tate, and every hand that just got raised then was an aggressive round of chemotherapy designed to irradiate him out of existence. There are also two evolutions above Andrew Tate. There's your Andrew Tate, who will say the horrendous stuff, and then you've got your Joe Rogans, who might not necessarily say the horrendous stuff, but they'll bring people onto their platform to say the horrendous stuff. And then you've got your Jordan Petersons, who will, with a couple of recent exceptions, not really say the horrendous stuff, but he'll tell you, no, the real problem is the radical opposition to the horrendous stuff. And that's how he operates. And what you have to do is, people like that, they'll often have a couple of degrees to their name, a couple of doctorates, they'll sound really, really intelligent. But what you have to do is you have to skip to the end. You have to go, what is the world that they're trying to create? What do they want? And if they take an issue like the issue of feminism or the gender pay gap, they'll tell you how, no, women choose these lower paid jobs. They choose to work part-time because they're looking after kids. But again, skip to the end. They are happy with a situation where women do just as much labor, pun intended, as men, but end up with less financial power. And in a world where we know that having less financial power in that man-woman dynamic can lead to some pretty serious consequences, ranging from the mildly abusive to the actually life-ending. Being okay with a situation where women end up with less financial power as your end goal, that is the world he's protecting. And the question you always have to ask is, what are you doing to change the status quo? I went on a debate recently with about the use of diversity officers in the NHS and whether or not it was clumsy. And I was up against some person from Spiked magazine, which, if you know what sort of politics they espouse, and I was like, all right, yes, diversity officers, it's a clunky solution to a systemic problem, but what is your alternative? And the guy simply refused to offer one, which means that if you go onto a show like that and your objective is, hey, this means of tackling bigotry and inequality, that's not okay, but you have no alternative, that is by definition a bigoted agenda. And it's not just Jordan Peterson types that invented this. Politicians do this all the time. They will not really say the explicitly bigoted stuff. They will basically attack any effort to get rid of it. They'll call it too woke. They'll call it too liberal, etc. They'll say it's political. In the government's race report a couple of years ago, it actually acknowledged the reality that several studies show that if you've got a name that sounds like you're from an ethnic minority, you have to send roughly between 70 and 90% more job applications to get a callback. So, which means that life in this, given that the ability to get a better quality of life is dependent on money, your ability to get money is dependent on your job, that means that life in the UK passes through a filter of racism, and yet the report tried to basically pretend that that didn't exist by saying, oh, it might just be because the employers assume that if you're from an ethnic minority, you're of a lower class. I'm sorry, that's racism. You're basically trying to use classism to cover up racism, which is an interesting tack to use, which is why the United Nations accused them of trying to normalize white supremacy. Now, there are practical ways to solve these things. My personal favorite is one, to either fiscally incentivize or make it mandatory that employers use name-blind anonymous CVs so that they don't see the name. So basically you have, on job applications, you have no name, no gender, no school, no region, basically the John Lennon dream. And therefore you get rid of all the initial barriers to getting to that interview stage, and then you can deal with that when you get there. And also, once you do start to see those people from more diverse backgrounds in those higher roles, you will then end up improving the perception of people from those backgrounds, and that kind of progress is self-sustaining. Another one is to improve history education, because I know that for me, my history education was basically World War I, World War II, invention of medicine, Industrial Revolution, basically stories about how white British people won wars and invented shit. Nothing about anybody from around the world, nothing about ethnic minorities within the UK. So of course we ended up with so much British superiority that we were convinced that one country would be able to control the negotiations with the EU, which means that you believe that 27 countries would be more damaged by loss of trade with one country than one country would be damaged by loss of trade with 27 countries, which inherently means you believe that this one country is inherently better than those 27 countries. arguably by a factor of 27. That kind of British superiority can only come from a failure of understanding of who and what we are. Third option, which is actually the option that really opens up the first two, and I think is the biggest challenge and opportunity of our generation, is the voting system. Because that is the biggest thing, because we cannot in this country realistically call ourselves a democracy. It's a joke. In almost every election. I'm not just talking about when the Tories win, when Labour wins as well. If you have a situation where in pretty much every election, a party that only gets a minority of the vote ends up with a majority of the seats, that means they're able to do whatever they want at all, pass any law they want, without having to even talk to the parties that were voted for by the majority of voters. That means the majority of votes literally mean nothing. How can you call that a democracy? If you take the last election as an example, the majority of votes went to parties that were committed to a second referendum, which means that if all votes had counted equally, we would still be in the EU, especially as I think Nigel Farage once said, if there was a referendum between Boris Johnson's deal...
Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time.
That's Nigel Farage saying that. If all votes had counted equally, that's what would have happened, and we would still be in the EU, which means all the poverty that we're seeing because of Brexit would not be happening if we had an equal voting country. The voting system is such a drain on our ability to progress, but it's also our biggest opportunity, because if you look at since World War II, every election, apart from 3, the majority of votes have gone to parties to the left of the Conservatives, because that's who we are. We are actually a progressive voting country, at least compared to the Conservatives. Yet they've been in power for 47 of the last 77 years, which means we consistently have a government that's more right-wing than the people themselves. Which means if we do get equal voting, we will start to be able to actually really address all the issues that we all deeply care about. If you look at the maths, in the last election, the Tories got 44% of the vote, but ended up with 56% of the seats. Labour got 32% of the vote and 31% of the seats, which means mathematically, Tory votes are worth 30% more than Labour votes when you compare seat share to vote share. And when you look at, obviously, who tends to vote for Conservatives versus more left-leaning parties, you see that people from ethnic minorities, their votes count less. Women, their votes count less. And if you compare it to the Green Party, Conservative votes are worth 18 times more than Green votes. So when you think about things like the climate crisis, how do you solve the climate crisis if a Tory party that I think gets millions of pounds from organisations linked to the fossil fuel industry, if their votes are worth 18 times more than the Green Party, but they're getting more scared of us by the day, especially given that proportional representation is now firmly on the agenda because Labour recently voted for it. We just now have to deal with the leadership that is, let's say, causing problems. But as I said, the more we can scare the politicians into actually realising they need our votes, the better. And as I said, they are actually getting increasingly scared of us. And this is one example, because in 2019, when they actually had the vote on whether or not to allow 16-year-olds to vote in the election, this is what Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative politician, said.
And whilst the age of voting, should be a debate that we have in this country, to suddenly thrust upon us right now, when we know it will probably favour one particular party, now's not the right time to do it.
Translation, if we let 16-year-olds vote, they will vote Labour and we won't be able to leave the EU. Yeah. Well, now all those 16-year-olds are now 18 and the Tories have nowhere to hide. And they are trying to find other ways of making things even harder for us. For example, the new elections bill, which creates a requirement to have photo ID, yet an Oyster card for over 60s is considered valid ID, but a young person's travel card is not. So again, deliberately trying to make it so that the people who are more likely to vote against them are disenfranchised. But this is the sort of thing that we are now aware of, and the more they try and do this kind of stuff, the more people will push back against it. And when I talk about Gen Z and Millennials, I often say that Millennials were your last chance to come quietly. Because when I look on TikTok and I see the attitudes of Gen Zs, they will not stand for this shit. It's that simple. They are furious and they will not stand for it. And so I am very, very glad that this kind of stuff, its days are numbered. Because, as Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. As I said, we're a progressive voting country. That is who We are. And ultimately, the people who are currently in charge, people who are posing these challenges, they are the past. We are literally the future. Thank you.